Time now for the interview portion of our program. As part of our four-part series on hacking through the ages, Info.sec Radio is pleased to bring you part one of a two-part interview with Chris Goggins, a.k.a. Eric Bloodaxe. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Dean.
Chris, how did it all start for you as a hacker?
It must have been, I was probably 10 years old. A friend of mine's father had gotten an Apple II to connect up to Dialog to research legal proceedings. And my friend wanted to show it out to me, so we went over to his house, and he turned on the new computer and dialed up with an old Hayes Micromodem 2 pulse dial into a particular network dial-up, and we followed the instructions and logged on the Dialog, and we thought that was really cool. And in looking over the information about Dialog, we saw that you'd actually connect up to it through Telenet, which is now SprintNet, but it was Telenet back then. Connect up to it by entering in a 5-digit network user address. And I said, well, gee, why are we entering in 415 whatever? Why don't we enter in 214 whatever? Since we were in Dallas, I said, let's see what there is in Dallas. So we changed a couple of digits and connected to something completely different. And I said, that's really cool. I wonder how many of these things there are. And it all sort of went off from there.
It seems in those days that a lot of people started out as phreakers. Were you ever a phreaker, or were you a phreaker first and then a hacker, vice versa?
Well, it sort of all went together at the time. I mean, you have to realize, if you're 10 years old and you're trying to call computer bulletin boards, unless you come from a particular kind of family, which I didn't, the long-distance phone bills that you'd incur trying to find bulletin boards to call would generally get you beat. And we didn't have that kind of money. So in order to try to find ways to get there, you as an enterprising young child, you had to find ways to make sure mom didn't get that phone bill. And that sort of led to things like long-distance services and things like blue boxes and stuff like that. So it all was sort of a natural progression because you had to have a way to make a phone call.
On the Phoenix board, on the Phoenix project, you had mentioned that you had spoken with Manuel Noriega.
No, never did that. We called Gaddafi once, posing as ABC News.
What was the end result of that call? How long did it last?
Not very, but we had a good laugh at it. I had several people set up, saying, okay, all right, we've got you on the line, all right, and having other people pretend to be producers and stuff like that. Yeah, that was interesting. It was at the time when he was trying to gain he was doing a lot of interviews to try to gain some sort of attention about something, so he was taking every call.
Did you ever talk to anybody else of any fame? I mean, it was pretty widely reported that you had a list of celebrities and other people's phone numbers.
It was widely reported? Well, that's interesting. No, actually, I didn't. We didn't really talk to that many people. I mean, in terms when we used to set up teleconferences, we'd blue box up teleconferences. The people that we'd talk to would generally be, we'd call random numbers in Australia just because we thought the accent was neat. Or, we'd call up people who were working the late night shift at a switch room somewhere and add them in. Or we'd call up security people from different parts of the phone company or from different organizations and add them in. That was about as much as the celebrity hunting went. I mean, a guy in a switch room is a lot more entertaining than some actor.
What would you say was the first incident to really raise awareness with the federal authorities about hacking? That's
a good question. My guess is the first thing to really raise awareness probably came from abuse of TRW credit systems back in the early 80s.
What was your favorite target when you were active?
There was really no favorite. I mean, it was just more or less looking for things that were diverse. Looking for things you hadn't seen before. And not so much in terms of information, but just in terms of operating systems. I mean, if you think back, we're talking 20 years ago here. If you think back of the kinds of operating systems that were around 20 years ago, there was such a diversity in the types of systems that you could find out there. I mean, now we're pretty homogenous. I mean, it's one or more flavors of Unix and one or more flavors of Microsoft products, and that's pretty much what everybody runs everywhere. You go back 20 years ago. I mean, there are 20, 30 different types of operating systems. So the challenge for me was always finding something different that I'd never seen before and trying to figure out what it was and what it did.
You were first a member of and then the de facto leader of the Legion of Doom, or LOD. What brought you all together in the first place?
What started the group to begin with? There was a guy in South Florida called himself Lex Luthor, and there were a couple of groups around at the time. One of the biggest ones at the time was a thing that called themselves Knights of Shadow. They were pretty much a close-knit group of friends, mostly centered around upstate New York. Lex said, well, I've got some other people that I think you ought to consider, voting into this Knights of Shadow group, because they're really smart and they know a lot of stuff, and I think they'd be really good people to add in, and they're good friends of mine. And the people in Knights of Shadow said, no, we're not interested in any new members. This is pretty much just people that we're friends with, and we're not interested in taking any new members. And Lex thought that was a pretty stupid way to handle things. I said, okay, well, fine, I'll start my own group. And there was about a dozen or so people that he had talked to. I said, listen, I'm starting this new group, and if you're interested in being a member, we'd like to have you. And I was one of that first round of people.
After Operation Sun Devil, the Phoenix Project and other BBSs were basically shut down. After reopening the Phoenix Project, ostensibly to serve everyone, including the authorities and telcos, how much actual interaction was there between the hacking community on that board and those people in government and telco?
Oh, there was a lot, even from the beginning. I mean, associating Phoenix Project with Operation Sun Devil is sort of a misnomer. I mean, there were two separate investigations headed out from two separate jurisdictions. Phoenix Project was part of something different when that raid went down. It wasn't part of Sun Devil. But to answer your question, the whole point of Phoenix Project from its beginning, I mean, when Lloyd Blankenship set that board up, the whole point was for it to be an open forum where people could feel free to talk and discuss things, not necessarily anything specific about phone numbers or passwords or anything. The board was never like that. The board was about concepts and techniques or information about how operating systems worked, or to provide a forum where people could get to know one another. And there was a large number of people from a bunch of the different RBOCs on there, and a bunch of different long-distance companies, and people from both federal and state law enforcement bodies. I mean, that was the point of the board. And there was a good deal of interaction, and some of that interaction, I would imagine, with some of the relationships that were made. I mean, some of that interaction probably occurs from the same people even today.
In January of '90, FRAC was shut down by the University of Missouri because government agents had been monitoring email accounts of various FRAC people. Apparently, this was because a FRAC issue contained the E911 document. Speculation was that it had to be more than simply copyrighted information that was being published in FRAC. Can you tell us what really forced the Secret Service's hand in that whole investigation?
To the best of my knowledge, I think at the time, you have to realize, 10 years ago, the level of awareness about computer-related crime in federal law enforcement was very small. They didn't understand it, and they were answering to a constituency of large companies that were scared, and so there were a lot of mistakes were made. And in the case of what happened with Craig Nydorf and FRAC, the Secret Service was given wrong information by the phone companies. The phone company basically made up stuff as a guess as to how information like that must have been obtained, and the Secret Service acted on it. And as I think people were well aware, the ultimate outcome of that was the proof that the document that was in question was actually available from a public source by calling a 1-800 number and giving $19.95 over a credit card. So, the fact that had to have been obtained by some huge plot to take down the nation's phone networks was proven to just be hysteria, and all of that was just fanned along by the security officials within phone companies.
What was the Secret Service's focus of their investigation on you?
Relationship to I had friends. My friends ran FRAC magazine. My friends were other members of the Legion of Doom who had contact with people with frack. I mean, it was just sort of, it all stemmed out of that. The initial thing came, and the whole thing started out in that particular investigation. There was a kid, I think he was probably 15 years old or something, who lived in Indiana, who had broken into some sort of credit card, either a credit verification service or into one of the credit bureaus, and was working on a way to try to send himself Western Union money with these stolen credit cards. And he got picked up. But because he was a minor, they said, well, you're a kid, but this is going to ruin your life, and you better work with us, and this and that and the other. And so he gave over some names. He said, well, these are people I know, and they're a lot smarter than me. And he happened to name some people who were friends of mine in Atlanta. And an investigation started on that. And then from monitoring phone lines and listening in on and transcribing phone conversations, they built up a list of other names, including some guys in New York, and including some guys in Texas, and including some guys in Missouri. And all of this sort of came about based upon, one kid who was actually trying to steal money, who most of the people who were picked up in that particular raid that stemmed around Frack Magazine, most of the people who were involved in that particular thing, didn't even know this kid in Indiana. He just started naming names because, he was probably scared.
Your postings on the Phoenix board during those 1990 raids were pretty vocal, and they seemed to represent somebody who was pretty darn afraid. When you look back on it now, do you think that you, or perhaps some of your concerns, were a bit misplaced?
No. I've said it. I've said it a number of times. I mean, if you're, even though I was pretty young and brazen, when you're young, you think you're bulletproof. When it all boils down to it, I mean, if you're doing something that's either inherently wrong or illegal, you take a chance. And looking in the grand scheme of things, everybody was me personally, I was just really lucky. But at the time, everybody expected the worst. People were being picked up, and everybody really expected the worst. I mean, looking back, it's easy to say, well, gee, they made a lot of mistakes in investigations, and they made a lot of mistakes in this, and they just didn't understand the technology, and they didn't do. But that's sort of looking back. That's sort of hindsight on the way investigations were carried out at the time. That kind of hindsight, of course, it's easy to have now, but at the time, who could have imagined that, the people that were tasked with investigating computer-related crimes at the time were really that woefully ill-equipped to do the job? So everybody expected the worst, and since then, a lot of the bodies that are involved in doing those kind of investigations have learned from mistakes that they made in the past, and I think probably most of the people who they were investigating learned from their mistakes of the past as well.
Was it a combination of the Morris Worm, the SRI people, and the frack busts that began another, with all that together, is that what began the second round of busts, and did things really fall apart as much as it appears between 1989 and 1990 in the scene?
Probably the Morris Worm raised awareness of networks and interconnections that most people didn't even realize existed. The wave of raids that came about during I'd even stem it back from like the mid '80s to I guess like the very early '90s. A lot of that was just it was a knee-jerk reaction to an assumed threat. It's understandable. I mean, the companies were scared. Law enforcement didn't know what to do, so they did the best thing they could, and that was to go collect everybody they thought might know something and see what they could figure out. And it didn't lead to a lot of convictions, but it was probably a good learning experience for everybody involved.
At the time, most of the scene was contained on various BBSs across the country. How big an adjustment do you think it was for some people to move from the BBS system and closed networks to the Internet?
I don't think it was that big of an adjustment at all. It lost a lot of the romance, but it made it a lot easier. Cut down on a lot of phone bills, cut down on a lot of toll fraud, cut down on a lot of things, and it opened up it opened up those same bulletin boards to a much wider audience. I mean, if your whole point in, at the time, if your whole social interaction took place through exchanged emails and teleconferences, moving to the internet and moving on to things like Internet Relay Chat or on Forum or any of the other earlier chat systems, I mean, it just made it that much more immediate, made it that much more accessible, and in fact, that's the proliferation of the internet is what made it so that what was once a pretty small, closed, a few hundred people around the world chatting with one another, it made it boom and made it accessible to where if you look on any of the computer hacker or so-called underground-related chat channels on any of the IRC networks, I mean, you'll see thousands of people. So I think the adjustment was, was just taking advantage of new technology, and everybody adjusted to it well.
Do you think that with that explosion in growth, that affected the cohesiveness and the tightness and the sense of camaraderie in groups such as LOD?
Oh yeah, I mean, well, when we decided that it was time to move on and sort of retired the group, as it were, it had already reached kind of that point. Thinking back to the early '80s, I mean, there were about 20 or 30 people that seemed to frequent things nationally, on bulletin boards, who were on like the same bulletin boards around the United States, or even when things started to pop up like in Germany and Australia, there was only the same 20 or 30 some odd Americans who could actually get there, who were actually participating in things like that. And so it was very easy to say, oh, hey, it's such and such, and you knew them. You may not have ever met them, because I wasn't doing a lot of domestic traveling when I was 10, but you knew these people. You knew them by voice, you knew them by skill, and you developed some respect for them. As any community grows away from sort of like that closed community of just a few people to thousands and thousands of nameless faces around the world, of course things really do change. And in some ways it's changed for the better. Having a larger pool of people who are interested in security vulnerabilities and things like that mean that a lot more things are going to get discovered and fixed. But at the same time, having a larger community means that you're going to get people whose idea of right and wrong don't necessarily dovetail in with anybody else's. And there are people who think nothing about breaking into systems and destroying data, or breaking into things for the sole purpose of spray painting their name on them, or people who are looking to make a quick buck off of trying to affect a particular company's stock price, or people who are looking for information to sell. When a community grows like that, you're going to have a lot of changes that are just unfortunately bound to happen. If you would have gone on any of the chat systems that were used 20 years ago, specifically there were some like localized things that people would use at colleges, like Wharton School of Business had a chat program that ran on one of their PDPs that a lot of people used to hang out on, and everybody was really friendly with one another. Now, if you extrapolate that 20 years ahead to present day, well, now you've got 10, 12 different IRC networks, each of them with their own set of people. If you go on any of the channels, pound hack, pound frack, things like that, you'll see 100 people on there, the vast majority of them who probably you'll never know, you never want to know, and who wouldn't trust you with anything, but not the kind of people you'd want to talk to, all of them in there sort of milling about. You're going to have a really weird cross-section of humanity. And that's just on those couple of channels. How many other channels are there? How many other people are there doing whatever? The proliferation of that kind of technology has enabled a lot of people to do a lot of really good things, but it's also enabled a lot of people who never would have held any sort of, I hate that hacker ethic sounds so trite, but who never would have abided by the same sort of self-policed rules that we gave ourselves 20 years ago, and that's unfortunate.
One of the things you're noted for is resurrecting, or giving credit for rather, is resurrecting frack when it needed it most after Night Lightning and Taryn King had left. You had written in one of your posts that you'd rather start something a little better written, better formatted, with better articles under a different name. Whatever happened to Matrix?
at the time when we were considering doing something like that, it was sort of that thing actually came about when we were trying to compete with FRAC. That was during the time period that FRAC was still going strong, and I think I was in an argument or something with Craig Neidorf or something, so we decided to put out our own magazine. But when it boils down to it, I mean, you want to go for what has name recognition. You want to do something, trying to keep some sort of consistency and some sort of ties back to the old days when everybody had sort of their innocence seemed important to me. And when FRAC in the 90s reached a point where it was either going to stop being published or someone could sort of take up the banner, I said, okay, fine, I'll do that. It just sort of made sense. I had time. I knew, I knew everybody who had been involved with it since its creation, and I said, okay, well, let's do this, but let's do it a little different. And the first thing that I did was to get it an ISSN number, and the next thing I did was to try to sort of throw something in the face of people who always complained about hackers, disregard for copyrights or anything like that. So I trademarked it and copyrighted the issues and said that it was free for individual use, but had a commercial use fee. And as I watched people hit the FTP sites or try to join the mailing list from various companies or various law enforcement bodies, I sat and said, see, they're not paying for this, and this is not for individual use there. So those are the kind of things that I wanted to do to further it. Plus, I wanted to have a section that would focus more on the community, so that people could realize, that they're really not alone. That people are exploring and uncovering and experiencing the same things that they're experiencing all around the world, and to try to put in more articles that were geared on not looking for articles that would really try to cause people damage. And I think I ran the thing for probably about 4 years until it reached a point in my life to where I just didn't have the free time anymore, and I handed it over to Mike Schiffman. He's sort of taken it his own way, and that's a good thing as well. I mean, at least it's still there and it still continues to evolve. But having that thing that people can point to say, that thing's been around since way back when. To me, that just seems sort of important, that something like that just continues to go on with the same sort of spirit that it was originally intended. The format's changed, the article types have changed, and the slant has changed a little bit, but it still embodies the same spirit that it did when it was written by a couple of high school kids in St. Louis, Missouri.
Do you think that it still serves the community as well?
Yeah, but the community's changed. I mean, the same people who were reading FRAC when it went out over BitNet in the mid '80s are all people like myself now. These are people with real lives and real jobs and real families, and everybody's grown up. And the community at large is not just centered on 15-year-old kids looking for a cheap thrill. It's centered on people who have an interest and a desire to learn about technology, and that's expanded from that small base that it used to have. It's expanded to a wide range of people from high school to college to professional people, to people who have a passing interest in computing technology, to people who have made their careers in computers and computer security. So the audience has changed, but it's still people interested in the same thing. It's still people interested in that technology for technology's sake, and information about how things work and why things act the way they do.
There's a lot of hype surrounding the scene. One of the things that legends are made of course, in terms of the LOD, was a supposed war with MOD. In issue 36 of FRAC, MOD satirized you with a program synopsis. Was there really an MOD-LOD war, or was it more to do with a clash of personalities between yourself and Fiber Optic?
Well, I think it originally started with an argument that I had with Mark Benny. And, he had his friends, and he expressed his opinion about me to his friends, and I had my friends, and I expressed my opinion about him to my friends. And it just sort of goes from there. I mean, you don't, in any kind of group, whether it, we could we could apply this if we were, well, let's pretend we're high school cheerleaders for a second. We were on one squad. Well, we don't like the people on the other one. And so, you're going to sit there, and it's almost as inane as that. I mean, we were basically a bunch of squabbling schoolgirls. I mean, it was just stupid. But looking back, I can see how certain enterprising authors might think that it'd make a good story. I mean, it certainly has a nice ring to it. The gang war that tore apart cyberspace. I mean, but that's just journalistic license, I suppose.
A lot of people have characterized MOD as being less concerned with ethics and more about doing damage. Conversely, LOD was characterized as being relatively responsible and holding some sort of hacker ethic, whatever that may be. Is that a fair characterization, or is that a bit overhyped?
Well, I'd like to think that at least we tried to embody something. There were certain rules that we had that if people looked like they were either straying away from what we considered to be acceptable behavior, we either got rid of them or let them know exactly how we felt. MOD, I don't necessarily think really cared. A lot of it had, a lot of the inner city street mentality sort of carried over into online relationships, and it was just sort of like, well, I gotta get respect, and if anybody's going to disrespect me, I gotta smack them down, and that's sort of how they carried out what they did.
Time now for the interview portion of our program. As part of our three-part series on hacking through the ages, Info.sec Radio is pleased to bring you part one of a two-part interview with Kevin Mitnick. Kevin Mitnick is most famous, of course, for being one of the highest-profile people ever to be convicted of unauthorized access to a computer system. Good morning, Kevin.
Good morning, Dan.
Kevin, there have been numerous accounts of your story over the years. Without rehashing the whole Shimomura-Markov scenario, is it fair to say that what the public has read about you and what they think they know about you is, to some degree, fiction? What in your mind is perhaps the biggest few misconceptions that the public has about your story?
Well, there's been a lot of inaccurate reporting about me, and unfortunately, this inaccurate reporting kind of started with John Markoff of the New York Times, in which on the front page it was reported as fact that I, for instance, broke into NORAD, wiretapped the FBI, planted a false news story about Security Pacific Bank losing millions of dollars after being turned down for a job, amongst many other factors. And that's what I really have to say is on a percentage basis, I would say it's 50-50, 50% fact and 50% fiction. And what it really has come down to is I was kind of created into this national icon of being public enemy number one of cyberspace. And I can say that in all my hacking, I've never acted with any malice to try to profit, to attempt to make a red cent, or intended to harm anybody. But that's not to say what I've done is right. Obviously trespassing into people's computer systems is wrong. But the Kevin Mitnick story has been very sensationalized and hyped up because people had agendas. The federal government needed to send a message and to kind of use me as a scapegoat to advance their own agenda. You had John Markoff and Satomu Shimomura. One of them kind of was on a personal vendetta, and probably both of them together would wanted to make the profit off my story. So what a better way to profit if you can create a very interesting story using sensationalism and hype. And as far as I understand, Mr. Markoff and Mr. Shimomura made well over $1 million in publishing a book and also in selling movie rights based on that book.
The stories surrounding your alleged attacks against NORAD and other military installations, those stories seem to come right out of a Hollywood script. If you can comment, what's the real story behind that relatively widely held belief?
Well, if you believe federal prosecutors, they've actually, one prosecutor told a federal magistrate back in 1988 when I was arrested for hacking into Digital Equipment Corporation's EasyNet. I think now they're Compaq. And federal prosecutors represented to the court that I could simply pick up a payphone and whistle into the phone or use the DTMF, the touchtones on the phone, and launch nuclear missiles. And based on that story and several other myths, I was held in solitary confinement for eight months. The NORAD story is false. I believe it was a rumor that was started by an ex-associate of mine who was a phone phreaker and just decided he would start a rumor. And you would think that any reporter worth his salt would have contacted NORAD and determined if this rumor is actually true. And of course it isn't. I would hope that NORAD wouldn't be susceptible to attacks, externally, or even internally, because of the nature of their job. But what I can say, it isn't true, and I don't think it's possible that any systems that would be classified or would control any type of air defense would be on publicly accessible networks. Then again, you hear about foolish mistakes even made by I think one of the ex-directors of the CIA, where he brought classified materials home and put it on his PC, which was linked to the internet. So I don't know, but I think it's highly unlikely.
One of the people, of course, involved in tracking you down was Shimomura. He's been pretty quiet on the entire affair since the publication of Takedown. Why do you think that he's remained fairly inaccessible to the media?
Maybe he's been hanging out with Julia lately. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe he's just doing computer security consulting for spook agencies or for whatever. Maybe for some reason he's maintaining a low profile. In my case, I have sincere belief that he broke the law in that he was intercepting my electronic communications without a court order. And there is an exception in the Electronic Communications Privacy Act that allows communication providers to intercept communications to protect their property rights. But when a federal investigation starts and the FBI becomes involved, it's not permissible for them just to have somebody that's a civilian doing intercepts without getting court orders, because if that person has the intent to assist the government and the government has acquiesced and has knowledge of what that person's doing, they're in essence a de facto government agent, and that's what Shimomura was. He was working very closely with an assistant U.S. attorney, I believe his name was Kent Walker, in San Francisco, and they were sharing information, and Shimomura would have been unable to track my location down on his own. It required cooperation on parts of other internet service providers and public telephone companies. And without the assistance, without the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office feeding him, basically confidential information that they only were privy to, he wouldn't have been able to, locate my residence in Raleigh. So, and there's a lot more to the story, but in brevity, that's the point I wanted to make.
It's been widely assumed, of course, that you had something to do with the attack on Shimomura's machine. Did you have anything to do with that or the voicemail messages?
Well, I can't comment on the attack on his machine, but I can comment. I wasn't convicted of that, so I'd be kind of foolish to discuss that part. But I can discuss the voicemails. No, not only did I not do it, I do not know who did it, and I did not put anybody up to it. I had no knowledge of it, and I think it was just a huge coincidence that those voicemails were left at the same time his machine was being attacked.
Have you had contact with either Shimomura or Markov since your release?
No, of course not. I do understand that John Markov was going to do a presentation called Kevin and Me at the Early Computer History Museum, I believe, at NASA Ames Moffett Research Center. And once I found out that he was going to be doing a talk about me after I was released, and knowing that this man defamed me on the front pages of the New York Times and simply justifies it in any way possible. In fact, when he's usually, put on the spot and asked, about these things, about NORAD and all these myths that he's, printed as fact or were included in the story on the front page of the New York Times, and he reverts to it, well, Kevin was reading my email. So it's like, does two wrongs make a right? Just because somebody reads your email, does it give you right to libel somebody on the front page of the New York Times? I don't think so. But to answer your question about whether I had any contact with Mr. Markoff, no. But when I found out about this Kevin and Me talk that he was going to give, I contacted my attorney, and my attorney, we were going to file a civil suit, a libel or slander suit, probably would have been slander, if he were to propagate any of the myths that he's already created about me. And we put him on notice, and then it turns out that when he did give the talk, because a few of my colleagues attended it, he did not discuss me. And I believe the reason he didn't discuss me is because he knew he was put on notice, and I think he was well aware that we would have definitely filed a lawsuit against him if he did make any misstatements about me.
I think there's also some confusion about what exactly your status is right now. Most people think that you're on parole, but you're not. What exactly are the conditions of your release at this point in time?
Well, I'm on what they call supervised release. It's similar to parole or probation, but it's technically different, and it's for the purposes of my rehabilitation and to protect the public, while probation is a form of punishment and parole is a form of punishment. Supervised release isn't. I have many conditions of supervised release. One, that I cannot possess or use certain types of things like computer hardware, computer software, computer peripherals, personal data assistance, wireless communication devices, televisions that have internet connectivity. I can't work for any computer business in telecommunications, computer software, or in the computer business. I'm not allowed to act as a consultant or advisor to anyone that uses a computer, amongst several others. But I believe they're the most draconian conditions of supervised release, and depending on how they're interpreted by the probation department, they can be interpreted in a sense that would be completely unreasonable. For instance, most recently I was in court because one of my conditions was, as it is worded on the judgment and commitment order, is the defendant shall not act as an advisor or consultant to any individual or group engaged in any computer-related activity. Well, if you read it literally, that means if you use a computer, I can't advise you on how to, fix your car. And I was contacted by several organizations, either that write articles on computer security-related topics, or to speak on my viewpoints of computer security. And the probation department initially was construing that if I speak or write about technology topics, that I'm acting as an advisor or consultant. And we challenged that as being unreasonable, because when the court imposed conditions that I not act as a consultant, we believe that the court meant as a computer consultant, which goes into a firm, assesses a problem, acquires, the appropriate hardware and software, and configures it and implements it and troubleshoots it and does whatever is necessary to get, the business at your consulting firm to get their problem solved. And in my case, where it was kind of working as a public speaker or a journalist, we thought was unreasonable. So we went to court, we challenged it. The court really sent a message back to the probation department that they can't just do a blanket denial of these types of things, that they have to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis, which, if you read between the lines, really means, is there any danger that the public, the probation department didn't want me to travel, so still at this point they're not allowing me to travel, but they do allow me to speak and write about, computer-related topics as long as I'm not traveling outside the Central District of California.
I think it's probably pretty obvious that you don't think that your rights or your privileges are being given back quick enough. How much longer do you have to endure the current conditions, and what would you like to see change between now and the end of your supervised release?
Well, I have up until January 20th, 2003, and what I hope is over time the probation department has the full discretion on all these conditions of supervised release. And in fact, every one of them is in their discretion. So if my probation officer thought it was safe that I could use a computer hooked up to the internet, then I could go ahead and engage in that. But I don't know how long it will take. For instance, when Kevin Poulsen was on supervised release, I think after like a couple years they allowed him to use a computer, and maybe after 2 years and 2.5 years they allowed him to use the internet. I don't know with me. They might just take a cover your ass approach and just decide to keep me under tight reins until my supervised release is up. And then once it's up, they have no control. Or they can decide to integrate me slowly and keep an eye on me. I have no idea what they'll do. Fortunately, I have a real good rapport with my probation officer, but since my case is of such high profile, of a high profile nature, I think any decisions in my case are made by several different people, going all the way up to the chief probation officer of this the Central District of California.
Assuming that the restrictions placed upon you as a condition of your parole are eventually going to be lifted, can we expect to see your version of the story in print or film?
Well, there's a problem there. As part of my plea agreement, I was kind of forced into entering this assignment agreement, and this assignment agreement basically for 7 years prohibits me from profiting off telling the Kevin Mitnick story, about telling certain aspects of it which happen to be the most interesting. And I'm going to have an attorney eventually, when I get some funds, to hire an attorney to really look at that agreement, because since I've already completely paid off my restitution and there's no civil judgment from the alleged victims against me, there's no outstanding monies owed. And the only purpose of the assignment agreement was if I were to make a windfall by publishing a book or doing a movie or doing some other commercial venture that talked about my unauthorized access into computer systems, that those monies would go to the victim. And we had a real big problem because, we believe that the losses, that the damages that the government alleged were completely, were grossly inflated, and that the victims and the government were in collusion because of some of the documents we received by subpoena. And the government largely based their claims of this large loss is based on the research and development costs of the software that I merely accessed. And I can say that the government has never accused me of using any source code, distributing it, selling it, or offering it for sale to anyone at any time. So with that said, I look at this as kind of like a breach of confidentiality, being a computer snoop, a computer trespasser, rather than engaging in some sort of like theft of trade secrets, which I think there's a huge distinction there because of the detriment, to the victim. So, is it fair to say if somebody read something they shouldn't have read, or accessed, some proprietary information but kept it to themselves, is it fair to say that these companies have suffered losses of all the costs, the time and cost incurred to develop that information? I don't think so, because I think a good analogy would be if George Lucas came out with they were developing a new sequel to Jurassic Park, and an attacker went into their computer systems and had an advanced version of the screenplay and read the screenplay but never had the intent of using it or distributing it for any other purpose. What has Lucasfilms lost? Well, potentially maybe a one sale ticket if the person didn't like the screenplay, and probably a gross invasion of privacy. But did they lose the millions of dollars invested in, or maybe the thousands of dollars invested in developing the screenplay? I wouldn't think so. And a more important point is when we were trying to expose the government's misconduct in inflating these losses, because we had evidence that they were soliciting companies to provide the R&D costs as the damages rather than the real damages incurred. The government sought and the court granted a motion putting all the exhibits and pleadings that had the monetary damages under seal, which are still under seal today. And I'm going to be making a request of my attorney to try to unseal these records, because I'd like to, get the truth out that the government inflated these losses as part of their plan to make me the poster boy for computer hacking. And that's not to say I haven't caused any damage, but I don't think it was anywhere near, $100,000, let alone $300 million, as the prosecution claimed on an episode of 60 Minutes that profiled my case.
You had a lot of support over the years, certainly during your incarceration, from the black hat, white hat, any shade of hat community. How much impact do you feel that the Free Kevin movement had on your case?
I think it had a lot. I had a lot of supporters behind me, because they realized that my constitutional rights were being disregarded, that I was being treated in a very harsh way by the federal government, and a lot of the community kind of understood what I was being accused of, and I think the community knew a lot of people were doing that, were accessing source code trees that they weren't supposed to look at for their own enjoyment, getting kind of as a trophy, and trying to study the ins and outs of the code. And I think the notion that I was held in solitary confinement in a past case for months based on an absurd claim that I can launch nuclear missiles, and that I was being denied a bail hearing. And a bail hearing is a statutory and constitutional right. And even though it's probably very likely that even if I was permitted to have the hearing, that I might have, I probably would have been denied bail. But the idea that the courts would just decide not to even allow me to have the hearing because the government has the burden of proof and the burden of persuasion to say that to prove or to persuade a federal court judge that the person poses a flight risk or a danger to the community, and they have to meet this burden. And it's kind of like a mini trial where the defendant has a right to testify, to proffer evidence, to cross-examine government witnesses, and present evidence that there's a condition or combination of conditions that will reasonably assure that person's presence at trial. And I never had the opportunity to have a detention hearing, and I think a lot of people were upset by that fact, because they saw or they realized if Kevin Mitnick could be denied a bail hearing because of the hype and sensationalistic reporting in the New York Times, and because the government had an agenda, of creating a hacker poster boy because of, I think they wanted to have a case where, they could hold up as a deterrent, that they can go ahead and disregard the rights of their individual citizens, that it could happen to them. That it could happen to Kevin Mitnick, it certainly could happen to any one of us. And I think that brought in a lot of support.
You've been listening to Part 1 of an interview with Kevin Mitnick. Part 2 will air on the next edition of Info.sec Radio. That brings time now for the interview portion of our program. Today on Info.sec Radio, we bring you Part 2 of our interview with Kevin Mitnick. Having all that support behind you, has it made it any easier in negotiating under your terms of your release to do things like speaking and writing engagements? Is that sort of support behind you, is that added weight when you're before the court?
I don't think so. I don't think the court or the probation department really cares about the support. I do think they have a concern about the media coverage, and I think it's like a double-edged sword. I think the media coverage of my case, especially with the inaccurate reporting and the myth of Kevin Mitnick that was created by the New York Times and subsequently snowballed into being reported in the national and international media as fact, I think that had an absolute detrimental effect on my case. And my attorney advised me during my pretrial detention, which happened to be for 4.5 years, I was held without a trial, that that it would be wise for me not to speak or to be interviewed by the media. So I never could say my side of the story. And now that I'm speaking out and the media is covering my case in, I think, a much better way, that it might be having a positive effect. But then again, the more high profile, the best thing when you're under the scrutiny of Department of Justice is to maintain a low profile. And unfortunately, that option is not available in my case. So hopefully I'll be able to, just be myself and discuss issues that people are interested in, hearing my side of the story, and hopefully the media reporting will be fair.
In hindsight, do you think that maybe things might have been different had you not taken your attorney's advice and had spoken out at the time?
No, I really don't know. I think, the problem is federal prosecutors are very, very talented at taking somebody's words and twisting them in a sense that makes it very negative for that person, because the only thing they have to do is push the district court judge's buttons, and the prosecutors in my case were very adept at doing it. In my case, they were very good at pushing her buttons. The government was very articulate at really pushing the judge's buttons to get her angry, and they used this strategy all throughout the entire litigation to really poison the court against the defense.
You've been quoted now, or it's been reported that you've been quoted, that you now want to give lectures on the negatives of hacking and how it's not something people want to do. Given the large amount of support you received from the Black Hat community and the Free Kevin movement, do you think that this in any way is a slap in the face to the people who supported you while you were in jail?
No, well, I'm not lecturing on the negatives of hacking. What I'm going out and speaking to is the methodology, like who are the hackers as distinguished from the attackers, because, hackers aren't criminals. In my mind, there is, not all hackers are criminals. I mean, some hackers can commit crimes, but I think hackers are really about people that are creative and inventive, and the engineers of today's, in my mind, are, hackers, the people that develop airplanes, the people that, work on, cars, the people that do, hacking is about stretching the technology to do things that it wasn't originally intended to do, and about coming up with shortcuts and making programs more elegant. Like, for instance, years ago, when memory was expensive, you try to write your code to use the least memory as possible. And just stuff like that. I think it's a very, a learning experience of, taking things apart to see how they work, and the thrill and the insatiable, appetite for curiosity and intellectual challenge is behind hacking. And I never intended, and I don't think I was quoted as saying that I'd be lecturing on the negatives of hacking. The only thing that I've said before is now, because of the cost of computer systems has come down from what it was years ago when, I started hacking in the late 70s, that people could set up their own networks or get or hack networks in which they have permission to do so, and not violate anybody's privacy, and they still get the same type of intellectual challenge, thrill, and learning experience without affecting anybody else. But what I was going to be talking about when I speak about computer security is just the, who the hackers are, that, not all the hackers are bad, and that a lot of hackers have actually revolutionized the computer industry. I consider people like Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson the people that developed the Unix operating system hackers. I believe that Stephen Jobs and Stephen Wozniak, who invented Apple Computer, are hackers of a sense, and they've all done good for the industry. What I intend to talk about when I do my talks is kind of like who the hackers are, what methodology or how do attackers break into your networks, and what are some of the things that you might do to mitigate the risk. So those are the things that that I intend to talk about, and not really get up on a soapbox and say how bad hacking is.
What do you say then to the folks who say that we shouldn't be taking advice from a convicted hacker like you? They often use the analogy of hiring someone like you to present a keynote as the same as hiring a burglar to secure your bank.
Well, then those people don't have to take the advice. They can simply go elsewhere.
At this point in time, I think a lot of people also want to know what you're doing then to support yourself. Are you receiving any funding from the Free Kevin movement? Who's paying the legal bills and who's supporting you now?
Well, I don't. Right now, I don't. I do owe legal bills, but I don't have any monies coming in for that, and I'm supporting myself. I've been involved in going to be writing a column for Contentville, and my first column I think is going to be published in September. I have a keynote address that I'm going to be delivering at the end of September for at a conference here in Los Angeles. My agent is closing a deal with KFI because I'm going to try out doing a talk radio, hosting a talk radio program. So there's a lot of things, a lot of doors of opportunity opening at this time, and that's how I'm going to be supporting myself.
Let's go back in time. As you know, this series is a three-part series on hacking through the ages. During your incarceration, a lot of your detractors would refer to you as the equivalent of a modern-day script kiddie, low on skills and relying on other people's tools. Given that there's a considerable amount of sniping in the entire Black Hat community, those comments are probably not very true. Can you give us a brief outline of some of your technical skills at the time?
Yeah, well, just to clarify, I really don't care what other people think about my skills. Just like, foreign governments would love to know the nuclear capabilities of this country, the less people know about my capabilities, as far as I'm concerned, is the better. And my technical skills, I've worked as a computer programmer, writing programs. I've worked doing system and network administration, and I have a good understanding of, computer security. I don't say that I know I'm the know-it-all of everything. I believe that there's people that are smarter than me, and there's people that are less smarter than me. And with that said, I know how to type, and I know how to program, and I understand. I have a good understanding of how certain, the vulnerabilities worked that I was using. Now, did I write any of my own tools? Usually, when I was hacking, I really, if I wanted to do something automated against a series of, or wanted to execute a thing, or execute a series of commands against several different targets, I'd usually write a script. Back in 1995, there wasn't the tools that are available today, and so a lot of it was done, kind of like by hand, and it wasn't like today where anybody can download a tool and sweep a network and try to find machines or boxes on that network, which are that a person or the attacker could talk to, and then trying to determine what ports are open, and then identifying the operating system, and then going into a vulnerability database and figuring out what exploits are available. That wasn't available back in 1995. In fact, my interests were, I had certain specific objectives. I was very interested in cellular communications. I wanted to know how the protocols, how it worked internally. I wasn't interested in reverse engineering the firmware, which could take years of time. So I decided, well, I'd take, look at the source code. So I set out about going and getting into companies that developed the cellular phone source code, and some of the tools I used, most of the tools I used was really my own mouth by speaking, but using social engineering techniques and combining it with technical attacks. And some of the tools that I've used were developed by others. A lot of them I just did it by hand. That's not to say I don't know how they worked. Of course I knew how they worked. It wasn't simply a point-and-click type tool that's available like today. And I guess that's really what I can say about that.
Well, what were you doing at the time that nobody else was? You were working with VMS.
Yeah, it was pretty much I wasn't really as interested in Unix as I was VMS. I had particular operating systems that I enjoyed over others because I was kind of brought up, in school on using those operating systems, and you just get, usually how people are is once they get used to something, they don't like to change. But I did learn a lot about Unix and a lot about the vulnerabilities when I was, involved in hacking. In fact, my enjoyment was actually targeting the systems of people that were, the top vulnerability researchers that discovered these holes. And I figured, those individual systems would be harder to get into and would really present a challenge. So those are the systems that I went after, and I was usually, successful. And then also my interest was in, cellular technology. And, would I spend the time to go ahead and write a tool from scratch when my objective was to get a source code tree and a certain version of cell phone firmware? No. What I would do is, go ahead and, see what was available, either through my sources in the underground or that were publicly developed by companies or other people. And that's to say, does anybody that needs to use a spreadsheet, any hacker that wants to use a spreadsheet program today, do they just launch on their Excel icon if they're using Windows, or do they go ahead and write a spreadsheet application from scratch? So I would have never accomplished my objectives if I did everything from scratch. Of course, I depended on a lot of techniques and tools that were available out there to accomplish my objectives.
Given that it was such a small community at the time, how much sharing was going on between yourself and other people active at that time?
Well, I usually associated with a very small group of people. I would say less than 5, and I was very selective in who I associated with.
It's been said, and you brought it up a little earlier, that you're a master of social engineering, and that may be, in fact, your most effective skill as an attacker. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I agree. Social engineering it was kind of surprising to me, but I was so successful at doing social engineering attacks that sometimes I wouldn't even have to bother with a technical attack. But what made me such an effective computer hacker, if you will, was the ability to combine social engineering attack techniques with technical attacks, and having both of those disciplines was invaluable at penetrating network infrastructures.
Tell us your favorite social engineering story, something that you did.
Well, one day when I was on the lam living in Denver, Colorado, I was working for this law firm, and then there was a brochure on somebody's desk that they let me see on I think it was the Motorola Microtac Ultralight. That looked like a pretty neat phone, and so on the way home, on my cellular phone, I called 800 information from Motorola, and within seconds I was able to find out where the engineering group was, what's called the Cellular Subscriber Group, where they were in Schaumburg, Illinois. And then I basically called on their public number and asked for somebody in the engineering group on this particular project. Well, I don't think the telephone operator really had a good idea of the different project managers in the organization, so I was transferred to, I think, this high-level manager. And he informed me that the person that works on the NAMPS Microtac project was this lady named Pam. So I called back the number of the switchboard and was able to get Pam's extension. I called, and there was a voicemail message from Pam basically saying that she was on vacation, and if anybody needed any help, to contact, so-and-so. So, I figured, oh, great. So, so-and-so's extension was on her voicemail. So I thought, okay, let's see if this works. And I just did it impulsively. I called that so-and-so and said, hey, Pam told me to call you when you're on vacation, and I need your help with something. And I told her that what I was looking for was a certain version of the firmware for this Microtac Ultralight phone. And she spent some time with me on the phone, and to make a long story short, I was able to explain to her how to basically take the source code to that particular version and compress it into one file, and then mail that file. Well, not actually mail it, but actually transfer it outside of Motorola's campus to an internet service provider in Colorado. So within I'd say a half hour of being on the telephone and without any callbacks or any verification that I was a legitimate employee, I had the source code to the firmware in Motorola's newest cellular telephone.
You were quoted in the Washington Post as saying that the weakest link in the security chain is the human element. Does this human element mean that there's always going to exist a degree of insecurity in communications technology, certainly in terms of your skills as a social engineering?
Well, absolutely, because the only way to prevent social engineering is by education, and more education. And unfortunately, the larger the organization, the more employees, the more chances somebody has to possibly use the art of persuasion to manipulate somebody. And unfortunately, since these large organizations, since everybody doesn't know on a personal level everybody else, how do people really verify that you are who you say you are? They usually do it by calling you back on the telephone, by looking in the telephone company directory, by using a facsimile, by using email, by using voicemail. And all those methods of authentication could be easily circumvented. For instance, at one cellular phone company that provided telephone service in Los Angeles, I was able to call up the voicemail administrator of that company and say I was with another sales office and that I'd be in town on 30 days working on a special project. Would he be kind enough to set me up a phone? And then after it was confirmed, I'd say, well, I really don't need the actual physical phone in the cubicle if you can just set me up a voicemail box. And within an hour, I had a voicemail box on this company's internal voicemail system. So anytime anybody would question the authenticity of my request, I'd say, well, just call me back. They go, what's your extension? And give them a valid extension, off their, PBX. And I'd say, well, I'm on the phone a lot, so if you get to my voicemail, just leave me the information on my voicemail. And I don't know. The voicemail box still may exist today. I haven't checked, and I don't plan to.
What role do you think that you've had in the evolution of information security and perhaps the perception of the average computer user about the security of their machines and their networks? You're pretty high profile, and you were at the beginning of all this.
Well, I think because of the sensationalism and hyped-up reporting about me, especially above the fold and on the front page of the New York Times, and again, a lot of libelous information being printed about me, things I did not do, but that would represent a serious threat to our country, like having control of nuclear missiles, so to speak. I believe it exploited the fear and the mystique around computers, and I think it probably had an effect of raising the awareness of people that computers aren't safe. And I think that even some individuals are really concerned about conducting e-commerce over the net because they're giving out private information that they fear might be intercepted by unauthorized parties.
Do you think that sort of FUD is mostly responsible for the public's fascinations with hacking and hackers?
I think it's the mystique in the fear. I think, unfortunately, that the public equates the term hacker with the term criminal. And my argument is not all hackers are bad, and a lot of them have done a lot to advance, technology in the computer industry. But you do have people out there that are malicious, that will try to steal financial information, divert financial assets, engage in industrial espionage. You have those, truly criminal types, but most hackers are really out for the recognition, the respect, the publicity, kind of the bragging rights and the showing off, the learning, the curiosity, the intellectual challenge, the thrill, and sometimes pulling pranks. I really consider the majority of hackers today being people that are just intensely interested in learning about computer technology and probably have the prankster, arrogant attitude, but they're really not all that bad. But then you have a group of people, unfortunately you can't stereotype hackers, But then again, you have a group of people that will have no problems in crashing computer systems, corrupting information databases, destroying information, doing denial of service attacks. You're going to have those group of people doing those sorts of things, and it's probably out of acts of hate or revenge or frustration that these people could not break into yahoo.com, so I couldn't break in, so I'm just going to go ahead and do a denial of service attack. You might have that type of mentality, which is senseless and juvenile. So you have a wide spectrum of people, on one end that are harmless learners that are just interested in exploring technology, to the other end where you're going to have foreign adversaries try to break into critical information infrastructures here in the United States to interfere with water, power, transportation, banking, finance, anything that could power grids, anything that could interfere with the American way of life. So it's really difficult to be redundant. It's difficult to stereotype these people.
Do you think we are witnessing the birth of a new intelligentsia?
Well, I think we're in the information age, and it's going to be interesting on how things play out.
From your perspective, how has the hacking scene evolved since the early days? I mean, what sort of trends have you taken notice of today?
Recently, since my release from custody, what I've really noticed, and again, I haven't, since I can't go online or can't use a computer, and I have the ability to talk to people I've talked to many people that went to H2K and DEF CON recently, and it seems like, the computer hackers are realizing that security is a real hot topic, and all these businesses that want to conduct their business over the internet are fearful of doing so because of the security implications. And a lot of these guys are figuring, it's like, what's the ideal world? To do your hobby and get paid for it. So now I see a direction towards commercialism where hackers are trying to get jobs as security analysts or penetration testers or developing tools to assist people in improving their security and getting paid for it at the same time. So it's like they're getting the best of both worlds.
It seems that we're still wrestling with how to properly secure networks. The internet, which are all essentially connected physically, with all the controllability, of course, that physical connection would seem to imply. However, we're now witnessing a tremendous growth in wireless technologies, such as PDAs, two-way messaging, remote email, and of course the ubiquitous cell phone. Given the problems that network administrators and most regulatory bodies have with securing physically connected networks, what do you think is going to be the security implications of an increasingly prevalent wireless society and wireless communications?
I think I even heard recently that there was some there was some vulnerability with some wireless technology or service. I don't recall what the specifics were, but I really think unless security is designed into the process, from the design of these systems, and not as an afterthought where you build security on a weak foundation, I believe that it's possible. And I really think the only way to really secure wireless communications or communications that even transverse through the internet or go over publicly switched networks or even through the telephone company is to use encryption. And I'm really an advocate of strong encryption because it really solves a lot of problems with network sniffing, hijacking, network connections, protecting the confidentiality, the integrity of the information. It really doesn't go anywhere to the availability, because even when, say, a user is connecting to a host and they're downloading a piece of software over a network, an attacker that's in the middle could actually send them, either can corrupt that information if it's in the clear, or actually, in cases that I've heard of, send them a completely different version of the program that they're requesting. So it's pretty scary, and I think, at least in the physical world, if internet service providers kind of went to like VPN, of course it would be an overhead, because anytime you use encryption, there's an overhead involved. But if the whole internet backbone was encrypted, I think it would really advance, or really take care of a lot of the problems, at least with network sniffing. But with wireless, I think unless some security design is built into the system, that there will be problems. And then again, you have the federal government that doesn't want strong encryption that they can't break, and then you wonder what rules and regulations is forcing upon the manufacturers of this stuff to weaken their encryption algorithms to allow the government to eavesdrop on communications. So I think it's all going to be very interesting, and I'm interested in how it's going to play out.
Kevin, I want to thank you for joining us today and being so candid. We appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Dan. Glad to be here.
Today on the Security Focus interview series, we're pleased to bring you an interview with Mark Abeni. Mark was once known as Fiber Optic, a member of the legendary MOD, Masters of Deception, hacking group out of New York City. Today, Mark owns his own company, Crossbar Security, and he joins us as part of our series on hacking through the ages. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Dean.
Mark, how did you make the jump from your TRS-80 to phone switches?
That's an interesting story. It was in the mid 1980s. I guess I fancied myself a phone freak, and one of the things that really fascinated me was telephone switches, and from information that I had gleaned off bulletin board systems, I found that the phone companies like to stick test numbers and various things in the suffix 9900. So, for example, just for sake of argument, 555, 9900 to 9999. In that range, typically would be various test numbers that the phone companies would put all their interesting stuff, and I would frequently scan those ranges of phone numbers just by hand, as would lots of other hackers at the time. And I actually came across phone switches that way at a rather unexpectedly, and I began experimenting with them, really, and talking with other people that I had met on BBSs who had experience in programming them.
What was your first successful hack? How did that feel to you, the first time you were able to successfully exploit a system?
It was, I guess, well, to really understand it, I have to go back to when I first got online. When I first got online, the first thing that I used was CompuServe. It was the software came with my my communication software, the subscription to CompuServe. So it was only natural to sign up for CompuServe, since it's what a lot of people did at the time. And that was really the first thing that I ever used online. The thing that made me realize that there was a lot more to the online world, in realizing just how small my little TRS-80 machine was there's an area in CompuServe that's probably still there, where they allow you to get access to their time-sharing environment, where you're actually interacting with the operating system. And it's there on purpose. It's not a backdoor or a loophole or anything. It actually goes back to the time where CompuServe originated, selling time-sharing access on their old digital hardware. And in playing around with this area on CompuServe, it really got me interested in bigger machines, getting access to these bigger machines and playing with them. Because at this point in time, I had already pretty much squeezed all the power that I possibly could out of my little TRS-80, and I was looking for more challenges. So from there, probably the first things that I actually hacked into that I can remember were some PDP-11 machines at some schools in Long Island, and that had default accounts on them. And apparently there were a lot of other people on there, both students and people who had found these systems. And it was a pretty open environment. I mean, everyone seemed to be playing with these machines, and no one seemed to really care that not everyone on them were necessarily students. But that was really the first time was getting into these systems on Long Island.
How did that feel? That was there. We often hear described, people's first hack or every subsequent hack thereafter as being a pretty big head rush.
Well, it was. I guess it was an intellectual rush. I really wanted to figure out what the system could do. It was just really interesting to me that I was now using my home computer sort of as a gateway to a bigger, more powerful machine that had lots of other people on it at the same time. And just tinkering with the thing and figuring out how it worked, and the various utilities and programming languages that were available on it was really interesting for me. It was a real intellectual rush. I started taking books out of the library about Fortran and Pascal and different languages that I now had access to that I never did before because they simply weren't available on my machine.
Your skills in the phreaking arena are fairly legendary. Just how easy was it to gain access to telco information in those days?
There was a fairly large body of information, which there were lots of other people out there at the time that were interested in the telephone network. And some of this information was factual, and a lot of it, probably more of it, was not. And it was in reading a lot of these, we used to call them G files, general files, which were just basically text files that people had written, describing various systems or exploits they had, and so on. In reading them, you really had to figure out, where the truth was, and where basically where the nonsense ended and where the truth began. And in all of them, there might have been like a little morsel of truth, but it really made me want to go out and figure out really, what the truth was about these systems, really how they worked.
Stacy Horn, your former employer at Echo, stated that you had broken into every phone company in the world. Is that true?
Well, I wouldn't say in the world, but I definitely had access to phone company systems all throughout the United States. From Dynex and Bell Atlantic all the way to Pacific Bell. My first brush with a telephone switch was in Dynex. But at that point in time, I didn't really know that much about them, which led me to actually get access to what was then the Southern Bell Data Network, which was in Bell South. Their network was actually an X25 network, which I was very familiar with, and it was set up on the same type of hardware as Telenet, which is now SprintNet. So it was easy to scan for addresses, looking for phone company systems, and trying defaults and things like that. As far as how easy it was, in some cases, again, this is back in the mid to late 80s, it was relatively easy. A lot of systems had unpassworded accounts at the time, and in even more cases, there were dial-ups that just let you straight into a switch without any authentication whatsoever, in some cases.
The Slatala and Quittner book, Masters of Deception, The Gang Who Ruled Cyberspace, portrayed you and the other members of MOD as whiz kids, sort of drawn together by some sort of common cause. What was that cause, if it existed at all, and how true to form was the book's recounting of that entire tale?
Well, as with any book, it was a good read, and obviously a lot of the technical details of what was going on had to be omitted for sake of keeping the storyline flowing. As far as a common cause, a lot of us early on were really interested in the phone system, so that drew us together. We were all interested in Unix and switches and how the phone system worked. The fact that at the time all of us lived in New York, so we actually met and would have hacking sessions where we just get together at one guy or the other guy's house, and we might do some social engineering, or occasionally we did some trashing at phone company installations, and we really took it from there. There was sort of a synergy going on between us that the more time that we put into the exploration, the more that we got out of it. It was very gratifying.
Was that how MOD got its start? Did MOD rise out of this natural curiosity that you and other people shared?
Well, you have to understand the time. In order to understand what MOD really meant, at the time I was still a member of LOD, Legion of Doom, and by accident I came across a couple of guys who had found a switch in New York, and I got in touch with them, and they got in touch with me, and we started talking, and it was really sort of a branching out that I thought that these guys had promise, and that they had something to contribute, possibly to LOD. The reason why MOD came into existence, at least in my opinion, I had nothing to do with founding it, and I don't know if I could say that anyone really founded MOD as a group. At the time it came about, it was more of a joke than anything serious. It really served to poke fun at the seriousness that younger kids on BBSs revered hacker groups, and a lot of them thought that this whole mystique was really silly, and MOD in a lot of ways was like a one-off of LOD. It never really stood for Masters of Deception. That was just something that stuck. It stood for various things, but they were all poking fun at hacker groups, really.
Yeah, you mentioned, of course, that you were originally a member of LOD, and one of the more legendary aspects of that whole time period was the supposed war between MOD and LOD. What happened between yourself and Chris Goggins that soured you on LOD?
Well, I don't like digging up sore subjects, but basically, it was a complicated time. A few friends of mine and Chris and his friends in Texas really didn't get along. A few things were in motion. There were a lot of hacker raids going on. There were a lot of raids going on specifically targeting LOD members. And at least in the way that I remember it, Chris wanted to sort of round up the members of LOD who were not busted and sort of rejuvenate the group, which I thought was a really bad idea. And I couldn't really understand his mindset. why he would want to do something like that. It seemed very dangerous. It was a time when it simply wasn't safe to be going around saying, "Hi, I'm a hacker." Also, the BBSs that he was on, or he possibly started, the fact that he was inviting law enforcement people onto these BBSs made me really question what his motives were. So between that and also at the time he had formed his own security company where him and his partners basically fancied themselves as hacker trackers, really attracted a lot of attention from the underground, not only from people that I knew, but lots of other people were, poking fun at his company and prank calling them. Because you have to understand, if somebody claims to be a hacker, and then they turn around and form a company and claim that they now track down hackers, they're going to generate a lot of flack. And a lot of people are going to think that they're traitors, which is basically what happened. And a few local friends of mine in New York were no exception. They didn't like what he was doing and how he was presenting himself. So he came under a lot of fire. And things obviously got out of hand between the people in New York that I knew and Chris and his friends in Texas. It was nothing more than really a bitching match. I wouldn't call it a gang war. That would be too flattering. That almost sounds like something out of Hackers Meet West Side Story or something.
One of the rumors that was floating around out there was that on a bridge, a racial epithet was used to describe one of the members of MOD. And Chris has stated that the whole MOD-LOD war was more a clash of personalities more than anything else. But that for him, the tapping of ComSec's lines was a turning point of sorts. Did you have anything to do with that, or was it, as it was reported, corrupt?
I mean, honestly, I didn't even know that ComSec's phone lines were tapped until I read the book. I mean, to really tell you the honest truth, a lot of the pranks and things that were played on Chris just to get back at his whole hacker tracker announcement, I really had no knowledge of. I mean, honestly, I was always much more interested in getting into systems and exploring things than actually lashing out at people. I mean, again, I was angry at Chris's desire to try to rejuvenate LOD in a most dangerous time period, and I was angry at his announcement of ComSec being hacker trackers. But that's basically where it ended. I wasn't on this crusade to try to monitor what it was he was doing. I really had no interest.
A journalist once described you as a person whose commitment to non-destructive hacking into dialogue with the straight world made him an ideal poster boy for civil libertarians' campaigns against the repressive excesses of the government's war on hackers. Are you, or were you ever comfortable with that label?
Well, it's a label I've had to live with. Really, to understand that label, you have to understand, again, the time period that this was going on. In the late 80s and early 90s, as hackers were more and more being thrust into the spotlight, a lot of the times I was unhappy with the people who were being interviewed and what they were saying. And I didn't want to stay silent and let these people essentially describe what it is that I do, indirectly that is, but basically describing hacking and what it is that they do and why. And a lot of the times I disagreed with it. And I basically took it upon myself to get in touch with media people, for better or for worse, because I didn't want to leave it up to someone else to be my mouthpiece. I wanted to be my own mouthpiece, and I definitely accepted a risk in publicly meeting with a lot of media people. All the while I was doing illegal things, breaking into systems. So it was definitely a large risk.
Yeah, the judge in your trial noted that the defendant stands here as a symbol here today. Others felt that you were being made a martyr for your generation. Were you a symbol for your generation of hackers? Do you think that you were a martyr?
In a lot of ways, yeah, and I think it was really evident from the amount of fan mail that I got when I was in prison. A lot of people felt that I was wrongly prosecuted. A lot of people agreed that the reason why there was the FBI and Secret Service made so much publicity around my prosecution was because I was a recognized name, and they wanted to send a message to younger hackers that they shouldn't be doing what they were doing. The problem with that is, there was obviously this backlash that instead of the intended message getting out, the message was that big business and government is evil. That was really the message that people got. And the ironic thing that drove the point home is that the people in the indictment that had the most charges against them were basically going to cooperate against me and got off. So, I mean, where's the justice in that?
Yeah, you decided to plead guilty to one count each of computer intrusion and conspiracy, when others who had been charged with more serious crimes had gotten off with mere probation. Why did you decide to do that when it seemed that all the evidence around you was that at that time people who were being prosecuted for more serious crimes were getting nothing? Why did you not take your chances with the jury?
Well, the reason why one or two people basically got off with probation was because they cooperated against me. I was basically the last one out of all the rest who were indicted who was still preparing to go to trial. And since I was essentially standing alone, and once I found out that at least two people out of the group who were indicted were going to actually testify against me, I felt betrayed, and I really didn't think that I could really stand up to a judge and jury in a full-blown trial. It really worried me. It was a very stressful time, and I really thought that I would get more harshly punished if I went to trial as opposed to plea bargaining.
Do you still feel betrayed today? Do you ever talk to any of those people?
No, actually, no. I haven't had any contact with any of them. I mean, obviously, I still feel betrayed by those who chose to testify against me. I didn't forget that. But I mean, you cut your losses and you move on. It's something in the past, and I don't really think about it much anymore. I'm trying to run my own business and really think towards the future as opposed to worrying about the things that troubled me in the past.
You were quoted upon your release as saying that prison didn't reform or rehabilitate you. You said, "I wouldn't do this again now, but only because I was caught. I'm not telling people not to do the things I did. There's always going to be people hacking. All I'm doing is cautioning them that they've got to be careful." Was that youthful bravado, or do you still hold that opinion?
Well, I hold that opinion to some degree. I'm a firm believer in the balance of power. To me, it still serves a purpose to have people who actually sort of live in that gray area, I feel that it keeps things in balance. It keeps the government from overstepping their bounds. I mean, it's a difficult area for me. I mean, I certainly wouldn't do the things that I did again, but by the same token, a lot of the skills and techniques that I used as a teenager, I use now professionally, and in a lot of ways, really, the irony of it is the only difference, really, in the work that I do now and the hacking that I did as a teenager is that now I have permission, and I basically get paid for it. It's a business.
A lot of your supporters during that time went to great pains to distance you from the actions of the other members of MOD. For instance, the selling of the TRW credit information. Can you explain to our listeners why it is that you shouldn't be painted with the same brush as those who were charged along with you? I mean, is there not some culpability in guilt by association?
Well, again, I mean, yeah, while I had contact with these people, you know, at the time I called them my friends, and I wasn't always aware of everything that they were doing. It's not like every time they were going to brush their teeth, they would call me up and make sure it's okay. You know, it just wasn't like that. You know, there was no leader of the group or anything like that. People basically, you know, did their own thing and at times collaborated with each other. But you know, as far as the more questionable behavior, like the selling of TRW accounts or the crashing of a PBS owned Unix machine. I mean, I really didn't know anything about that at the time it was happening, and if anything, it made me kind of angry because when it all came down to it, it made my case really difficult to argue because the government and the U.S. Attorney's Office was trying their best to lump me together with that unethical behavior, and it really left a black mark on the whole indictment, and it left me with a really difficult position to defend.
Yeah, after your release at the party in Manhattan, one person was quoted as saying that hackers were exercising their freedom and pushing the frontiers, and to some extent were important for American society. Do you agree with that?
Well, again, I feel that that hackers provide this balance of power. They make up the system of checks and balances. Today, I think that's most evident on the internet with hackers that actually find security weaknesses and develop exploits for various different Unix systems and so on. And I think this serves a very important purpose. This full disclosure keeps the operating system vendors in check. It basically, in my opinion, keeps honest people honest and makes sure that software gets updated as often as it should.
You've gone on to other projects now since your release, and of course working at Echo, most notably starting Crossbar Security. Has it been difficult for you to get contracts based on your past history?
No, in fact, it's been a plus. We've done very little marketing. The majority of contracts that we've done have been through word of mouth, through people recommending us to other people. Initially, when I was doing work for a large accounting firm, that was really my initial entry into the security industry on a broad scale, doing tiger teams and so on. And subsequent to that, me and a couple of other colleagues decided to form our own consultancy, simply because we felt that we could do it better on our own. essentially. But no, it hasn't. My past hasn't been a problem at all. It's only helped me. I mean, people typically come to us because they know who I am. I have that name recognition.
Well, I'm curious then. An article by Kevin Polson on Security Focus recently brought out in the open the problem that convicted hackers, yourself included, have found getting jobs in the security market. Do you think that there's a double standard being applied in the computer security industry to those convicted and those who haven't been caught but are well known to have hacked in the past?
Oh yeah, there's definitely a degree of elitism going on, both by hackers and by corporations. I mean, corporations hire hackers all the time. It's a fact. It's something that they don't like publicizing, which is fine. But there's also this elitism going on with hackers who, I mean, in my opinion, consider themselves better than other hackers because they never got caught. And I would turn around and say that, well, they just got lucky, essentially.
So the elitism from 8 to 10 years ago still exists today?
Well, how do you mean?
Well, it seems to me that that whole sense of bravado about being able to compromise systems, it was pretty much a hierarchy. There were legends of that time that were well respected. I mean, it's all over the Phoenix bulletin board system, at least in the text files, that there were, certain people who were considered to be very, very good, and other people were had derision heaped upon them in some of those postings. And yet today, again, we're faced with those same things. We have some relatively well-known people in relatively high positions in large security companies. And you made the point yourself that there's elitism happening between hackers today. And it seems to me that these are some of the same people who were active 8 years ago.
Somewhat, but I also get the impression that it's a lot of people who want the best of both worlds. They want people to think that they were, some big time underground hacker when in fact they really weren't. And I think that I mean I don't want to mention any names, but it's just in my opinion it's a gray area. You have conferences like Black Hat. I mean, and you have to think, what does Black Hat mean? Well, according to the security industry, a white hat is a good guy and a black hat is a bad guy. But who goes to Black Hat, the conference? Well, basically, a whole bunch of connected, industry insiders, lots of corporations and government. And then you have, so-called hackers who work in the security industry, and I think that there's definitely this one-upmanship going on. It's sort of like an old boys network developing, with the hackers of today who have gone professional, who want to distance themselves from the hackers who once dwelled in the underground of 10 to 20 years ago. And there's definitely this rift developing.
What's changed the most over the past 8 years in terms of hacking and the scene, as it were?
Well, the thing that's definitely changed the most is the scene itself. It's arguable whether there really is a hacker scene anymore. I don't know that there really is any that would compare to the way it used to be. The internet is basically the biggest change that's been introduced into the mix. I mean, prior to the ease at which people can communicate with each other on the internet, we basically made long-distance calls to BBSs all over the country. It was, it was a very separate altogether experience from the way people communicate on the internet, which is basically point and click. I mean, 10 to 15 or even 20 years ago, BBSs were few and far between. and they usually only had one phone line to dial into, so only one person could call them at once. They would basically read messages, read email, and post some messages, and that was basically it. And maybe sometimes chat with the system operator. And that was basically how information was shared on, on a very individual basis, sort of one at a time. It's not like today on the internet where hackers, may hang out, or at least wannabe hackers may hang out on internet relay chat, or some similar chat system or message board. So that's probably the biggest difference, is the ease at which people can communicate with each other.
Given the explosion in tools, rootkits and scripts available that, as you pointed out, are point and click, what do you see as being the biggest problems for computer security in the near future?
The biggest ongoing problem is, besides the obvious, everybody knows denial of service problems are a pretty big problem. But as far as security exploits and rootkits and things like that, the biggest problem is in people making them so easy to use that they've essentially removed all responsibility from their use. Essentially, anyone can download, a script or a rootkit and figure out rather easily how to use it. And in the majority of cases, it's used to the detriment of someone else, unfortunately. At the same time, though, it's important that these things exist because, security professionals use security exploits in order to do jobs because they have to see how well their clients' systems hold up against these exploits because, kids are out there trying these exploits against their clients' machines. So it's a tough argument. A lot of people in the industry have argued that full disclosure and publishing of security exploits is wrong, that it puts very dangerous tools into the hands of irresponsible people, which, is partly true. But on the flip side, it also makes these exploits available to professionals who can review them and also use them on jobs. Which is invaluable to a client, a large corporation. So there's a choice that has to be made. Is it for the good of everyone, or is it to the detriment of everyone? And there really is no easy answer.
Mark, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Sure.
And the de facto leader of the Legion of Doom, or LOD. What brought you all together in the first place?
What started the group to begin with, there was a guy in South Florida called himself Lex Luthor. And there were a couple of groups around at the time. One of the biggest ones at the time was a thing that called themselves Knights of Shadow. They were pretty much a close-knit group of friends, mostly centered around upstate New York. Lex said, well, I've got some other people that I think you ought to consider, voting into this Knights of Shadow group, because they're really smart and they know a lot of stuff, and I think they'd be really good people to add in, and they're good friends of mine. And the people in Knights of Shadow said, no, we're not interested in any new members. This is pretty much just people that we're friends with, and we're not interested in taking any new members. And Lex thought that was a pretty stupid way to handle things. I said, okay, well, fine, I'll start my own group. And there was about a dozen or so people that he had talked to. I said, listen, I'm starting this new group, and if you're interested in being a member, we'd like to have you. And I was one of that first round of people.
After Operation Sun Devil, the Phoenix Project and other BBSs were basically shut down. After reopening the Phoenix Project, ostensibly to serve everyone, including the authorities and telcos, how much actual interaction was there between the hacking community on that board and those people in government and telco?
Oh, there was a lot, even from the beginning. I mean, associating Phoenix Project with Operation Sun Devil is sort of a misnomer. I mean, there were two separate investigations headed out from two separate jurisdictions. Phoenix Project was part of something different when that raid went down. It wasn't part of Sun Devil. But to answer your question, the whole point of Phoenix Project from its beginning, I mean, when Lloyd Blankenship set that board up, the whole point was for it to be an open forum where people could feel free to talk and discuss things, not necessarily anything specific about phone numbers or passwords or anything. The board was never like that. The board was about concepts and techniques or information about how operating systems.
Time now for the interview portion of our program. As part of our four-part series on hacking through the ages, Info.sec Radio is pleased to bring you part one of a two-part interview with Chris Goggins, a.k.a. Eric Bledax. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Dean.
Chris, how did it all start for you as a hacker?
It must have been, I was probably 10 years old. A friend of mine's father had gotten an Apple II to connect up to Dialog to research legal proceedings. And my friend wanted to show it out to me, so we went over to his house, and he turned on the new computer and dialed up with an old Hayes Micromodem 2 pulse dial into a particular network dial-up, and we followed the instructions and logged on the Dialog, and we thought that was really cool. And in looking over the information about Dialog, we saw that you'd connect to it. You'd actually connect up to it through Telenet, which is now SprintNet, but it was Telenet back then. Connect up to it by entering in a 5-digit network user address. And I said, well, gee, why are we entering in 415 whatever? Why don't we enter in 214 whatever? Since we were in Dallas, I said, well, let's see what there is in Dallas. So we changed a couple of digits and connected to something completely different. And I said, that's really cool. I wonder how many of these things there are. And it all sort of went off from there.
It seems in those days that a lot of people started out as phreakers. Were you ever a phreaker, or were you a phreaker first and then a hacker, vice versa?
Well, it sort of all went together at the time. I mean, you have to realize, if you're 10 years old and you're trying to call computer bulletin boards, unless you come from a particular kind of family, which I didn't, the long-distance phone bills that you'd incur trying to find bulletin boards to call would generally get you beat. And we didn't have that kind of money. So in order to try to find ways to get there, you as an enterprising young child, you had to find ways to make sure mom didn't get that phone bill. And that sort of led to things like long-distance services and things like blue boxes and stuff like that. So it all was sort of a natural progression because you had to have a way to make a phone call.
On the Phoenix board, on the Phoenix project, you had mentioned that you had spoken with Manuel Noriega.
No, other members of the Legion of Doom who had contact with people with FRAC. I mean, it was just sort of, it all stemmed out of that. The initial thing came, and the whole thing started out in that particular investigation. There was a kid, I think he was probably 15 years old or something, who lived in Indiana, who had broken into some sort of credit card, either a credit verification service or into one of the credit bureaus, and was working on a way to try to send himself Western Union money with these stolen credit cards. And he got picked up. But because he was a minor, they said, well, you're a kid, but this is going to ruin your life, and you better work with us and this and that and the other. And so he gave over some names. He said, well, these are people I know, and they're a lot smarter than me. And he happened to name some people who were friends of mine in Atlanta. And an investigation started on that. And then from monitoring phone lines and listening in on and transcribing phone conversations, they built up a list of other names, including some guys in New York, and including some guys in Texas, and including some guys in Missouri. And all of this sort of came about based upon, one kid who was actually trying to steal money, who most of the people who were picked up in that particular raid that stemmed around FRAC magazine, most of the people who were involved in that particular thing, didn't even know this kid in Indiana. He just started naming names because, he was probably scared.
Your postings on the Phoenix board during those 1990 raids were pretty vocal, and they seemed to represent somebody who was pretty darn afraid. When you look back on it now, do you think that you, or perhaps some of your concerns were a bit misplaced?
No. I've said it a number of times. I mean, if you're, I mean, even though I was pretty young and brazen, when you're young, you think you're bulletproof. When it all boils down to it, I mean, if you're doing something that's either inherently wrong or illegal, you take a chance. And looking in the grand scheme of things, everybody was me personally, I was just really lucky. But at the time, everybody expected the worst. It was worked or to provide a forum where people could get to know one another. And there was a large number of people from a bunch of the different RBOCs on there and a bunch of different long-distance companies and people from both federal and state law enforcement bodies. I mean, that was the point of the board. And there was a good deal of interaction, and some of that interaction, I would imagine, with some of the relationships that were made. I mean, some of that interaction probably occurs from the same people even today.
In January of 90, FRAC was shut down by the University of Missouri because government agents had been monitoring email accounts of various FRAC people. Apparently, this was because a FRAC issue contained the E911 document. Speculation was that it had to be more than simply copyrighted information that was being published in FRAC. Can you tell us what really forced the Secret Service's hand in that whole investigation?
To the best of my knowledge, I think at the time, you have to realize, 10 years ago, the level of awareness about computer-related crime in federal law enforcement was very small. They didn't understand it, and they were answering to a constituency of large companies that were scared, and so there were a lot of mistakes were made. And in the case of what happened with Craig Nydorf and FRAC, the Secret Service was given wrong information by the phone companies. The phone company basically made up stuff as a guess as to how information like that must have been obtained, and the Secret Service acted on it. And as I think people were well aware, the ultimate outcome of that was the proof that the document that was in question was actually available from a public source by calling a 1-800 number and giving $19.95 over a credit card. So, the fact that had to have been obtained by some huge plot to take down the nation's phone networks was proven to just be hysteria, and all of that was just fanned along by the security officials within phone companies.
What was the Secret Service's focus of their investigation on you?
Relationship to I had friends. My friends ran FRAC magazine. My friends never did that. We called Gaddafi once, posing as ABC News.
What was the end result of that call? How long did it last?
Not very. But we had a good laugh at it. I had several people set up, saying, okay, all right, we've got you on the line, all right, and having other people pretend to be producers and stuff like that. Yeah, that was interesting. It was at the time when he was trying to gain he was doing a lot of interviews to try to gain some sort of attention about something, so he was taking every call.
Did you ever talk to anybody else of any fame? I mean, it was pretty widely reported that you had a list of celebrities and other people's phone numbers.
It was widely reported? Well, that's interesting. No, actually, I didn't. We didn't really talk to that many people. I mean, in terms when we used to set up teleconferences, we'd blue box up teleconferences. The people that we'd talk to would generally be, we'd call random numbers in Australia just because we thought the accent was neat, or we'd call up people who were working the late night shift at a switch room somewhere and add them in, or we'd call up security people from different parts of the phone company or from different organizations and add them in. That was about as much as the celebrity hunting went. I mean, a guy in a switch room is a lot more entertaining than some actor.
What would you say was the first incident to really raise awareness with the federal authorities about hacking? That's
a good question. My guess is the first thing to really raise awareness probably came from abuse of TRW credit systems back in the early 80s.
What was your favorite target when you were active?
There was really no favorite. I mean, it was just more or less looking for things that were diverse. Looking for things you hadn't seen before. Not so much in terms of information, but just in terms of operating systems. I mean, if you think back, we're talking 20 years ago here. If you think back of the kinds of operating systems that were around 20 years ago, there was such a diversity in the types of systems that you could find out there. I mean, now we're pretty homogenous. I mean, it's one or more flavors of Unix and one or more flavors of Microsoft products, and that's pretty much what everybody runs everywhere. You go back 20 years ago. I mean, there are 20, 30 different types of operating systems. So the challenge for me was always finding something different that I'd never seen before and trying to figure out what it was and what it did.
You were first a member of an